Catus Maximus here. This time, a random Amazon hydraulic crimping tool. I did a video about a Harbor Freight one, which is the same as this. It's this one Chinese manufacturer has just been pumping these things out for a lot cheaper than the commercial ones. You can get them as cheap as like open box for like 50 bucks or something. I found this at a junk store for 25 bucks. Anyway, I had a Harbor Freight one like 5 or 6 years ago, but I was low on cash. I ended up selling it, and I kind of regretted that, so I finally picked one up many years later for a great price, one that seems like it's only been used a couple of times. So, real simple. It's a wire crimper. Just like these are wire crimpers, this happens to be for coaxial cable, and then this is for smaller wire terminals. These are for large wire terminals. They're generally recommended for copper wire and not steel cable, although you can get away with using these with steel cable. They have a lot of crimping pressure. It's like 3 to 5 tons. The issue is that when you're crimping steel cable, they tend to have the ferrules tend to be pretty thick, and you have to be very careful to select the dies that will just get the crimp tight enough to hold the steel cable without being oversized. And it's because the steel is so much tougher than the copper, where the copper and their associated crimp ends, like these, are a bit softer, and so they squish around more. The steel has a lot less squish. So if you use too small of a dies, they can crack along the roots. And that's the only thing to really keep aware of. These all set are measured in metric, and so the crossovers to AWE or standard average wire gauge, you just have to be kind of careful. But that's the whole point of these things, is just the fact that they're hydraulic crimpers, and so they can get a lot of pressure. You know, the big thing for a lot of people is if they're doing bigger electrical cables, particularly like car stereo installers and that type of stuff, are always working with thicker wires and really getting using vices and vice grips and all sorts of things to try to crush the connectors under the wires. That's where these things really come into their own. And they're so cheap, and so many people actually do have a use for big crimpers. There's tons of videos about these on YouTube and all sorts of different cases. They're all the same. They all come with extra O-ring kits. They all are hydraulic, where you kind of want to burp them a little bit or bleed them before you use them. Oddly enough, this has all the sizes except for what was labeled a number 4. It didn't have. Instead, it has these black ones labeled as 1/8 inch, which I think is going to be too small for this. I believe this 10 gauge wire I'm working with. 8 gauge wire that I'm working with here. So the easiest way to really tell what size terminal is first to get a terminal that you think is about the right size. These are like I think they were from like a jumper pack or something, these little leads. So I was just going to put some terminals on them so I can use them as kind of test leads with a power delivered leads, heavy duty alligator clamps with a benchtop power supply. But I will give them credit here, because this is about the finest wire I've ever seen, so it explains its flexibility. So you get the terminal that's going to be the absolute smallest and still allow you to get the wire in there. That's one key thing. You don't want to go and grab some giant terminal and try to crush it down onto a small wire. You're going to have a real bad time with that. So once you've gotten the terminal that appears to be the right size, then what you do is you take the dies. They do have little magnets to hold them in. Is you kind of do a little test fit thing here. And so we can see that these 1/8 inch dies are just going to be way too small, and it's just going to smush it out in between the dies. So 1/8 inches out, and you kind of start going up through the sizes here until you find one that looks like it's going to be about perfect. That's still going to be too big. These that are labeled number 6, I guess. I mean, these things are cheesy. I mean, it looks like they used... I mean, I don't know why one has a bigger number on it than the other, and why one is in one direction than the other, but that's kind of the deal with these super cheap Chinese units. Go up to the next size. Probably going to be still too small. These are going to be number 8s. These are number 10s. Those are looking pretty good. What we have here is we have just a slight gap there, and that's exactly what you want. The deal is that you're using a terminal that already is, the wire pretty much fills all the way up, so you don't actually have to crimp very much onto it. And you can always double check by getting the next larger size. In my case, this happens to be 16s. And if we put the 16s together, we can see that those won't crimp at all. They're too big. So it's just trial and error. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of sizes. So it looks like, once again, we're going to use the 10s to attempt to crimp this cable. And that once it should be absolutely perfect. So we'll toss those into here like so. Easy peasy. And of course, for the fidgety point here, we are going to try to this thread and twist this on here, getting all the wires in there. Somehow I just managed to magically do it. Make sure that the wheel is nice and tight, and then crank it up a few steps to start to get the dies pretty close. Then we'll pass the terminal through. And this is always the fidgety point. And I should make a note. These terminals that I'm using here, you can see that they're formed out of a piece of tube. So they're seamless terminals, and they're actually better to use. Many terminals will have a little seam, and you'll want to make sure that seam is facing either up or down right in the middle of the die. Anyway, make sure that your terminal is properly centered, and you can just use your fingers to kind of get it started there. And doesn't really use that much force. And you just run it until the handle stops, and that's when the dies have come together, and it really will. It'll just lock up hard. So you know that you've finished crimping. Release it. And what you have here is a nice little hex-shaped crimp. Oh, and so in my case, just simply wasn't tight enough. So even though those seemed like they would be the right size, they still just didn't get quite enough crimp, and so I'll have to do it again, but using the next size down. And hopefully that works out. That's always kind of the annoying thing, the difference between, I mean, there's multiple differences. These are cheap terminals, so they have a, so that the walls here are exceptionally thin, where premium grade terminals are going to have thicker metal. And the difference between these dies technically being metric dies and trying to use them on basically AWG or fractional wiring. Usually it's not a huge deal, but in this case, it just didn't work out. We'll try this again. And just run it down till the handles stop. We're done there. With the fine strands, it's hard to get them all in there. And so you can see what I was talking about. If the dies are just a little bit too small, then it'll smoosh the connector out each side. We can see how much force this thing has because it smushed the connector out and then crushed that. It actually swaged that metal super thin. It's actually 2 layers, and it's way thinner than this because of it simply wouldn't fit. But in this case, that's the choice that you have. These are for AWG, and I believe I'm correct on that. And with the dies they offer you, you have two choices. And obviously the bigger size produce a nice little hex crimp. And this hex crimp may have actually worked. I mean, it did swage it down. If I had a little bit thicker wire, maybe if I was trying to put 6 gauge into one of these. So I had to use the different size ones. And in this case, it's really still just fine. You just end up with these kind of funky wings on each side. And for most purposes, this will be just fine. I mean, the real issue here is that because you've crushed this metal out, technically there's a little bit of weakness right here. And so if it's a wire, like welding cables or something where the wire is actually going to take repeated stresses, then this can become an issue. And you'll want to find another way to crimp with your given connectors. But almost, in any situation where you're not actually, they're not undergoing physical tension and abuse, then this will hold up just fine and works great. And the deal with crimping wires is, besides the obvious, having them crimped tight enough, is if you really badly over crimp, then you'll actually smoosh the wire and thin it out. The idea with the crimp is that it's just tight enough to take all the strands and kind of mash them in as if they were one single piece. There we go. Just did the other cable. I'm probably going to... I did not do a super great job on this one, but nonetheless, it's a really solid crimp. And versus trying to use pliers to kind of mush it, the nice thing about these type of die crimpers is you're surrounding the whole connector when you're crushing it down rather than trying to smush it flat and hope it's going to hold together. And even using too small of a die still works great. Those are some great connectors on those terminal ends. So that's my kind of tips about hydraulic crimpers. Review and tips video. These things are invaluable. They do produce nice, reliable crimps. And like in my case, the other set of dies, the number 10 dies, would have worked just fine, but I happen to have extremely cheap terminals with extra thin walls for this given wire size. Professional or nice high quality professional grade terminals can have a bit thicker walls and probably would have crimped just perfectly. And once again, these will work on steel cables. I mean, it's common, it's kind of a modern thing to do, like stainless steel cross cables for, not guardrails, but handrails and that type of thing. And you can certainly use these to crimp those little steel ferrules. And that's kind of the nice thing about these, is they are certainly multi-purpose. But man, if you're working with big, automotive battery terminal cables and any other heavy-duty wire, it's the way to make terminals that you can actually, bank on, that you can rely, that will actually stay together and remain, properly conductive. Thanks for watching.